Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for giving us some time this Saturday. My name is Patricia Wyrick. I am the Rural Forestry Program Coordinator for South Dakota Department of Agriculture and Natural Resources. We are very appreciative that Melissa Cry with Pennsylvania State Extension is presenting on Carbon Markets 101. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items to bring up. Today's presentation will be recorded, with recordings being placed on the DANR's YouTube channel for public viewing once reviewed and approved through our technical support team. DANR is an equal opportunity provider and wants to encourage participation. However, if you would not like to be a part of the live recording, an email will be sent out to everyone who registered for this webinar when it becomes available. For assistance, we turned on the transcripts and captions to try helping anyone who might have troubles with hearing. All microphones and videos have been turned off, and due to bandwidth concerns, we request that they stay off during presentation. At the end of the presentation, we will be taking questions. All your questions can either be placed at the chat box during the entire presentation, or you can raise your hand to be allowed to talk during the end of the presentation. All video will be turned off. It has been limited so that you can't turn the video off, so that we make sure that the bandwidth stays. So with that, we are honored to have Melissa Cry, who is an assistant professor of Forest Resource Management and Extension Specialist in the Department of Ecosystem Science and Management at Pennsylvania State University, presenting with us today. In 2019, she launched the Forest Benefits and Value Program to help build a better understanding of the social and economic value of concerned private forest lands. Recent projects include an examination of the social value of bird conservation on private forest lands in Pennsylvania and landowner demand for prescribed fire assistance programs in the northeastern U.S. Dr. Cry has two nationally recognized extension programs. One is the Effective Environment Outreach Strategies Program, which trains educators how to conduct impact assessments for behavioral and economic impacts for environmental education programs. The second is Forest Carbon Markets 101 series, provides a training to forest landowners on forest carbon and carbon markets using direct instruction and expert panel discussions. Dr. Cry recently received grants from the National Institute of Food and Agriculture and National Science Foundation to help expand the forest carbon training program to the Northeast, and we are so thankful for her to give us her time and help us a little bit understand it in South Dakota.
Thank you very much. That was a great introduction. We're expanding to the Northeast region, but actually I have a feeling that it's going to be much broader than that. I see here there's a poll. Can I submit this poll right now?
I think you can. Okay. And if you can, I will make sure I can. Let's just reopen poll.
Okay, so I just wanted to get a sense of who's part of this program today, and I wanted to be able to speak to maybe your perspectives a little better. Let's see. Oh, I see. I gotta put down I'm an educator. It's polling me. I got it. Okay. So who do we have? Did the poll finish?
It should be taking some more. It's not closed yet. Okay. We'll let it go for about, let's do another 30 seconds.
I had to explain that I'm less familiar with this platform, so I'm still searching around to figure out how to do things. But and I want to apologize too. I'm just getting over a cold, so you'll see me some drinking water and kind of being a little after the fact, but I'm feeling fine to present, so that's good.
Well, and this is my first experience using the polls along with some of our people on the line. So I understand the feeling, because I do believe there are more landowners than the 4 responses we currently have.
Sounds
But
good.
with that, we're just gonna close this real quick. And we can try this and see how this one comes across too.
Okay, great. Why are you interested in learning about forest carbon markets to support land steward objectives, part of your organization's strategic plan, maybe a new source of revenue? I'm here to learn something new. All great, great reasons. And I will say, as these come in, the reason why I got into talking about forest carbon markets really is because of the interest in Pennsylvania. As you described, I do a lot of other work looking at the landowner decision making for forest management across a variety of reasons, prescribed burning, conserving bird habitat. So it just happens to be that carbon markets have been the topic of interest late. So
I've got a few comments that I think our polls aren't quite working the way we were hoping to, so we'll just close those. But I do know from looking at our attendees that there are quite a few that are private landowners.
okay, that'll work for me. Let me go ahead and share my presentation here. Okay, is this the presentation mode here?
Yes.
Okay, great. So this program I deliver in coordination with Calvin Norman. He is an educator here at Penn State Extension, and he teaches more on the side of forest carbon dynamics, and then I'm more on the economics and policy side. And so I'm here in presenting for both of us today. So just to get started, kind of the big picture, most forests in America are privately owned, 58% in fact, and also just by nature of how private landowners are deciding to approach forest management, we're growing more wood than we're cutting. So our forests actually operate as a carbon sink right now and offset up to 16% of U.S. emissions. So this is actually pretty unique because in Europe they manage their forests more intensively, and so they're coming around to this idea of growing more wood than they cut. But we're already doing that in America just by the nature of how we approach forest management on private lands, non-industrial private lands in particular. So investigation as to which type of land uses provide the most potential for climate change mitigation, forests really come out on top. And the type of forestry includes reforestation, which means, growing new forests, but also natural forest management. So that means basically managing forests to be healthy and to be growing and thriving. And this provides a place to have working forests to maintain the provision of wood products. So it is a function of natural forest management. You can keep both. And then, of course, there's other types of land uses and land cover types that have climate change mitigation potential, but forests are definitely on a lot of people's minds as the pathway forward for climate change mitigation. The question I get a lot from forest owners, I think, is really reasonable. They're starting right at the beginning and they're asking questions like, well, how much carbon is in a tree? And I have to tell you that this is a great place to start, but when we talk about carbon markets, we're going to go a little further than this. So I'm going to go ahead and just give you the short answer to this question, because we could spend all day answering this question. But the short answer is you can calculate how much carbon is in a tree by basically measuring 1/2 the dry weight of the biomass in that tree, or the biomass in a stand. So there are some pretty straightforward allometric equations out there. You can Google that. I have like a description here, and they'll show you all kinds of ways to calculate how much carbon are in trees or in a stand if you understand the volume of wood that is in your stand. So it's all based on that. And so if you're really good at you know, doing equations and putting together units that you're trying to like compare, then this is a great exercise. But there is straightforward ways to understand how much carbon is in trees. And this is in fact used to understand the value of carbon. But it's not the carbon in the trees that has value. It's the potential of that tree to store carbon in the future, because that's what's being sold in a market. And its potential is related to offsetting emissions. So you can't offset an emission with carbon that's already stored. You have to offset it with new storage of carbon. So the potential of carbon sequestration in a stand is a stand level kind of analysis. And a lot of people are using remote sensing now, as well as ground proofing to do that level of analysis. It's dependent on stand density. Some parts of the US have just more dense forests naturally than other places. Pennsylvania compared to South Dakota is an example of that. The average stand density across the states are really different. Of course, you know, depending on individual properties, you know, stand densities can be similar. But, you know, when we're looking at averages, the two states are relatively different. The rate of sequestration has to do with the species of tree, the weather conditions, you know, the health of the stand, these kinds of things. Stand age is an indicator of the potential of carbon sequestration. So younger trees grow quickly, they sequester a lot of carbon, and as they get older, they become better at holding on to that carbon. So the kind of switches there. And actually, I think Calvin talked about this a few weeks ago when he was presenting to you folks about how carbon, the dynamics of carbon within a stand. So stand age does have an influence, and species composition. So trees, hardwood trees are long-lived and really good at storing carbon, where, you know, if there are trees in a tropical context, that they may grow quickly, but they also don't live as long and they decompose faster. So all these things influence the value of carbon. And is used when we talk about the value of carbon in a carbon market. So this figure here I created to kind of help separate two important concepts. One is that carbon is maintained in our forest if we manage it, you know, to where every tree that's removed is replaced over time. And that's what most forest owners do. They want to maintain their stands. They want them to be healthy. And then they're also going to extract timber every once in a while and extract firewood, you know, and all these things are fine if there's a consistent replacement of trees. So that means that, you know, a forest can remain carbon neutral if there is some regulated extraction, that it's sustainable. So that's the status quo kind of condition in many cases. But when we talk about the value of carbon, we're talking about additional carbon storage. So there has to be some change from the status quo that then allows carbon that's being emitted, and this is my little factory that's emitting carbon. That's basically biomass from the fossil that's been fossilized from, you know, millions of years ago, is now being released, and that energy, I'm sorry, that carbon, it's creating energy when it's released, but that carbon now has to be taken up. So it's additional carbon that has to be taken up with additional efforts to store it. And that usually involves a contract that guarantees that sequestration will occur in the future. And so that's what the value is based on, really, is the potential for carbon storage. That's additional to this, that's different from that status quo kind of the ongoing carbon cycle. So there's two ways that carbon accounting is done in a market context. One way markets work is to create new sinks. They're trying to encourage additional carbon being stored in the trees, so that, or stored in some cases in the soils, or, you know, underground, you know. But when it comes to forest, it's about creating forest to be a sink. And then another strategy is to reduce emissions. And this is the concept of where forests can also be a source of carbon release if they're harvested. And so if you ask someone to delay harvest, that delay, when you aggregate it with everyone else delaying their harvest, is a strategy for reducing emissions. It's more like slowing down the leak is honestly what it is. But these are the two ways of thinking about carbon accounting. One has to do with creating a sink, and the other one has to do with minimizing or slowing down emissions. And that's going to come forward when we talk about these forest carbon markets, these two strategies. Now, there are a growing number of project developers working with non-industrial private forest owners in the US. And this is a list that I have started compiling, and it keeps getting longer and longer. And there's no way I could go through all of these project developers because of just time. But I want to just point out a couple of things here. Each one of them have different kinds of contract designs when they're working with landowners. Some of them approach forest owners using very simple contracts, and other ones require very robust contracts. So simple being like short contract length. You don't have to do much. There's just like limited actions you have to take, where a moderate or robust contract is asking for a longer contract, 20, 50, 100 years, and you have to actually take some action. You have to have a management plan, and you have to get certified and all these kinds of things. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit more as we go on. I'm going to highlight, though, with all these companies coming online, they're coming from a bunch of different directions. Some are coming from outside the US and are coming in. Others are emerging here in the US. The project developers, sometimes they come from a background of business and industry. Sometimes they come back from a background of tree genetics and forest management. And some of them come from a background of remote sensing technology. And they're all trying to get in the forest carbon game. And so they all have a different angle, which may or may not be legitimate, as we're going to talk about, because there's some challenges with forest carbon market. It's not like it's just something you should be aware of. And I have Compass Carbon put in red here because one of their executives for Compass Carbon was recently convicted for insider trading. So, this is the Wild West. Carbon markets are seen as like a new way to take advantage of what's really a growing market. And so there's a lot going on out there. And I think that landowners have they deserve to know what's going on from someone who's honest and objective, like myself as an educator. I don't have any invested interest in making sure any of these programs are successful. I'm interested in helping landowners succeed. Okay, so let's talk about the initial kind of market structure that most people think about when we think about controlling air quality and pollution, and that is this cap and trade structure. And so this is called a regulated market, or it's basically a market where some level of government, either state level or federal level, comes in and puts a cap on how much emissions can be allowed to be released from industry, and then they allocate to those industries credits where they can then these credits allow them to pollute. And so if they need to pollute more, then they have to buy these credits. Or they can take that money and invest in technology that helps reduce emissions. And so it's this credit trading system that is backed up by the government. And it's found to be really successful with other forms of pollutants, like carbon dioxide has been very, very successful in lowering carbon dioxide emissions, which were responsible for things like acid rain in the past, which were really damaging to forests. So a lot of people look at this cap and trade type market strategy as being a really good one for climate solutions, because it's a very rigorous approach. And I'll get into what that looks like. This cap and trade strategy is being used throughout the US. So there's the Western Climate Initiative, but that kind of fell off in the last I think in the last 5 or 10 years. And it's not so much the West anymore as California and Quebec have a market that works specifically with private forest lands. And they have, and the reason why they do is because they have something called a CARB project. So the California Air Resources Board has defined how forests can participate in the market by saying how it is, what's required for them to be able to create a credit that is traded within the market. So what are the requirements for forest participation? And I'm going to get into that in just a minute. I will point out that the California and Quebec market has been increasing in value. Right now, a ton of carbon being sold in this market, it has an average price of about $18. And you can see that that value has increased over time since 2014. So it's a steady market and it's growing. And there's a lot of people interested in having their forest be designated as qualifying for a CARB project, so it can be traded on the California-Quebec market. I'm going to highlight really quickly here the Midwestern Regional Greenhouse Gas Reduction Accord and the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative here in the Northeast. Both of these do a cap and trade types approach to reducing carbon emissions, but they don't really involve forest at this point. I've been looking into them as trying to understand when a CARB-like project might be, verified and allowed for credit training within these initiatives. But so far, that hasn't really come on. So basically, the only cap and trade in the U.S. that includes forest is the California-Quebec market. Okay, so what project developers are on selling on this market? There is a project or program called Finite Carbon, and they've been around for I think over 10 or 15 years. And their strategy is to create carbon sinks to help forests become a carbon sink. And they've had projects developed with major landowners over 3 million acres. So when I say major landowners, they're really working with very, very large land, so usually industrial land. So they have a new program called Core Carbon, which is the option for non-industrial private forest owners, so smaller landowners, but that has only just gotten started. So this has been the challenge all along for a lot of landowners, is that because of the acreage limitations, they haven't been part of any sort of carbon programs. But Finite Carbon is well established. Their projects are certified through CARB, which is that regulated cap and trade market. They have 100-year contracts. They require that the forests be certified, like SFI certified and some other certifications. And their projects have to demonstrate things known in the carbon market world called additionality, permanence, and non-leakage. So that means they must demonstrate that there is additional carbon being stored over time. That storage is permanent. It's not going to go away. And the leakage concept is that if you store carbon in this forest, that it doesn't result in a tree being cut down somewhere else, because then, they kind of cancel each other out. So this is the most robust contract. This is the most robust approach that's out there. Finite Carbon has been demonstrating that on private lands for quite some time. And but for the most part, this is kind of inaccessible for a lot of forest owners. Let's switch away. Let's move away from this cap and trade regulated market, and let's talk about carbon offsets. And this is the voluntary market. And this is where corporations voluntarily say, I want to offset my carbon footprint. I want to mitigate my impact on the climate. And so that is what they're asking project developers to provide. So they are voluntarily approaching project developers to buy programs, or projects that are going to offset their carbon footprint. And this is done through certified brokers that provide accountability. And so in the voluntary market, 1 metric ton of carbon equals 1 carbon offset. So that's kind of the carbon credit that's being traded there. It's a metric ton. Oh, and then here's the figure that outlines that. Now, the voluntary carbon market has been growing tremendously, and this is a figure that shows its growth since 2005, and you can see that it's pretty much trending up. And even more significantly, in 2021, there was a 60% growth in sales on the voluntary offset market, which is basically there was like a real explosion in demand and an explosion in people providing these offsets too. And the average price right now in the voluntary market is about $4 a ton. And so it's less than the regulated market, which I said was $18 a ton. But the voluntary market's a little bit more accessible to non-industrial private forest owners. I guess this cold is still affecting me. And the reason why the offset market's really important is because project developers are able to develop all kinds of different projects and customize them for different kinds of buyers. And that would be the energy sector, consumer goods sector, finance and insurance sectors. All these folks are looking to meet their objectives of social responsibility by offsetting their carbon footprint. And they're looking for projects that fit multiple objectives. And I'll talk a little bit about what an offset project looks like. And these projects can be customized to provide additional benefits to attract clients. And I'll give an example that and I'm going to talk about this program here shortly, is that some programs will say, well, we're going to work with just people who are private forest owners in this region. And that appeals to some corporations where they're like, oh yeah, I want to, make sure that benefits are distributed in this region because it's important to their objectives, social responsibility objectives. So they can craft projects that appeal to certain sectors. So let me. You're like, well, who are these project developers? And I'm just gonna skip to this slide real fast and then go back. So the corporations, here's some example of corporations that are buying offset projects, and that's Delta, Microsoft, and Amazon, like major players. They have a lot of money they can spend on this stuff. Project developers are the ones that are responsible for basically overseeing that the project is done. They arrange the contracts and with the landowners and who's doing the inventory, and they're the ones that are basically in direct contract with the landowner and the corporations that are buying the offset. They're the middleman, if you will. And these include, so here's just some examples of some project developers that I'm familiar with. And sometimes they're a private company like Blue Source, where they just do forestry consulting primarily, and sometimes they're an NGO like the Nature Conservancy. So, they come from a whole bunch of different directions. Sometimes they're investment firms, and sometimes they have this other social or environmental objective. A registry is what provides the framework and oversight. So it kind of validates that the projects that are being created are legitimately creating the offset the offsets that it promises. So when the credits are traded, that they maintain their value. So the registries are important for maintaining the value of the carbon market. And they provide the protocols of what projects qualify. And then there's often third parties that are involved, like consultants and other folks that will go in and will provide support to project developers and registries. So all these people are interested in legitimate offset projects that are, meeting certain requirements. And the registry is interested that they're meeting the requirements of additional carbon storage, permanent storage of that carbon, and non-leakage. But when they're selling this carbon to, when the developers are selling these projects to corporations, the corporations take a look at what are the objectives of the project. So they'll use a mix of strategies. Some projects will include a combination of involving renewables and then land use or some other strategies. You can see that forestry and land use are an important aspect of many of these projects. They're looking for co-benefits as far as like, is this also providing, and when we think about like forestry and land use, you know, is it also providing wildlife habitat? Is it providing revenues to certain categories of landowners? Features like the scale of the project and location of the project affect its value. The rate of carbon sequestration, as I talked about earlier, affects the value of a carbon project. So, and that rate is not just at the tree level, but it's at the stand level. So they're going to be looking spatially, like what areas have greater rates of carbon sequestration. And then risk of accidental release. So, and that's something that, you know, is like a big issue, I think, that needs to be overcome in South Dakota, is accidental release from wildfire hazard. And that's something that is, I'm not really sure that project developers have entirely figured out yet, because right now they're working in regions of the U.S. that are less vulnerable to wildfire. Now, they do work in the Appalachian southern region, and wildfire is increasing down there. So they're having to face this question. But right now, a lot of projects are interested in the Northeast because they can kind of remove that risk of wildfire, and they only have to look at risk from storm damage and disease. And then, of course, the value of an offset project depends on who certified it, because some corporations are going to prefer some registries over other registries. Okay, so case number 2. Here is a carbon market program that's probably going to be coming to your state if it's not already there. And it's called the Natural Capital Exchange. And their strategy is to reduce emissions from harvesting. So they don't work in a way where they're trying to create a carbon sink. They're trying to slow down the leak of emissions. And right now they're already working with non-industrial private forest owners in most states in the US. You can go to their website and you can put in your state, and they probably have something in there. They're backed by Microsoft, so they're super techy, this group. They use very sophisticated remote sensing, artificial intelligence. They have a robust forest data set. They do a lot of things from a distance. And the way that they set up their contracts with landowners is that you go into their website, you put in, you know, you designate where your land is, and then they'll run their analysis virtually with remote sensing and their data set to determine the potential for carbon storage in your forests. And then they will come, and I think they have consultants on the ground. And that's another thing, is that they do have, every one of these programs have local consultants on the ground where they go and actually take a look at your stand and talk to you about it. And then the Natural Capital Exchange will tell you how much carbon storage potential your forest has. But they're not going to offer you a price. They're going to ask you to submit a bid for delaying harvest for 1 year. That's the contract. There's no other action. It's just you delay harvest for 1 year, and then you bid how much you're willing to accept. Now, this is called a short-term harvest deferral, and they're working with a registry called Vera right now to certify this strategy, and it's still under review. It's been under review for a long time because there's a lot of questions about whether or not it's going to provide additionality, because it's this whole delay harvest after 1 year. So there's the question of like, well, what happens to the carbon once it is released? You know, is this slowing down, you know, actually creating a reduction in the atmosphere? So these questions are still being asked, but I just thought I'd let you know that they are operating, and Microsoft is really backing them up. But they're still waiting to get their methodology approved through Vera. Oh, certification pending. There you go. There's a paper in Mississippi State Extension run by some folks down there in collaboration with some silviculturists here in my department too. And what they did is they set up some scenarios where they said, okay, so we're going to have different scenarios where we're going to grow. And this was pine stands where, you know, they have a strategic plan where it's planted new on bare earth, and then they manage it with different thinnings and different, you know, treatments, fertilizers and stuff, and then they harvest at a designated point, and then they look at the value of that stand, and then what it meant to delay harvest for 1 year under these different types of management strategies or scenarios. And what they found was that delaying 1 year could range in opportunity cost from $4 to $40 an acre, depending on, you know, how much you've invested in that stand, and you know, at what point you were planning to harvest it, and what kinds of products, the value of the products that come from the stand. So the quality of the trees, you know, is it going to saw logs? Is it going to chip and saw or pulp wood, or, you know, so there was a lot of things that depended on. So it's kind of difficult for forest owners to do this bidding process. This is just my opinion now as an educator, that calculating opportunity costs is not always straightforward for everybody. So bidding can be a challenge. Okay, so here is another program. I'm sorry about like having to like emerge all these bullets. I didn't know that they were going to be showing up randomly. And this is the Family Forest Carbon Program. So they're backed by the Nature Conservancy, is the project developer. And I think corporations there that are involved with them, oh, I want to say it's Pepsi or Coke. I honestly don't remember, but if you go to their website, they have all the major corporations that are basically their buyers. But yeah, the American Forest Foundation and the Nature Conservancy are the ones that are the project developers, and their strategy is to help forests be a better sink, as well as reduce emissions from managing forests, from a working forest. And they have already launched in the U.S. They're here in Pennsylvania, and I don't know how many acres are already enrolled, but they have a target of 16 million acres throughout the Appalachian region, which means that their corporations that they're working with know that they're looking to secure projects through that will include about 16 million acres in the future at some point. So the way that they approach things is that they do remote sensing as well, just like the Natural Capital Exchange. But they do it a little bit different. Their workflow, their plan of action is a little bit different, and actually their methodology is being reviewed by Vera as well. So this is still a pending approach, and the way that they do this is that they're paying landowners to engage in best management practices. So that means improving forest health by managing invasive species, protecting soil health, and then they also work with a baseline. So and this is the concept where if you establish the status quo baseline, and then everything, all the carbon that's sequestered or the volume of wood that's grown above that baseline is considered additional. So they work with the concept of baselines, and they use something like counterfactual counting, where they basically provide evidence that there's additional carbon storage on enrolled forests compared to forests that are not enrolled in their programming. So this is, they have slightly longer contracts than a year, 30 to 50 years, but it's not that 100 years that you know, that's being outlined by Finite Carbon. And most importantly, they really appeal to forest owners who are more conservation oriented, because a lot of the best practices that they help support, it helps enhance other ecosystem services, wildlife habitat, water resource protection, these kinds of things. So I would say that, you know, this program is a really good fit for people that are like interested in like conservation easements and legacy planning, because it's really about maintaining the value of all the benefits that come from private forest lands. Excuse me, one moment. So this whole question of like how much should landowners expect from being part of a carbon market was one that my graduate student and I approached. And the way we did it is we looked into the literature, we looked at a whole bunch of studies that asked forest owners how much they were willing to accept as payment for sequestering carbon on their forests. And this involved 13 studies that occurred at different states and at different regions of the US. There were 36 observations of mean willingness to accept. So they would ask anywhere between 50 and 600 landowners how much they're willing to accept. And so we got these mean values from those studies. And it represents about 20,000 forest owners, opinions throughout the US. And so we put all of this data together into a model called a meta-analysis regression model, and then we adjusted that model so that the variables in the model represented different kinds of contracts. So there was the simple contract, which is that 1-year contract and delay harvest, which is sort of like the natural capital exchange. Then we adjusted it to represent the moderate style contract, which is 20 to 50-year contract. You have to delay harvest sometimes, and you have to have a management plan. And then there was this robust contract, and that is so the moderate contract was like the Family Forest Carbon Program, whereas the robust contract is like Finite Carbon, where there's a 100-year contract. And again, there's some, you have to change when you harvest, and you have to have a management plan. Another thing that we found in this analysis is that not all landowners are willing to accept the same amount of money. And there are some that are willing, about half of landowners are willing to accept up to 75% less compared to the other half of forest owners. And so we called these people who are willing to take 75% less early adopters. They're the people that are going to get involved in a carbon market for reasons that don't have to do with offsetting opportunity costs. Maybe they want to be climate stewards. Maybe they're just trying to like get a little assistance to help pay for management. And they don't really have, like production objectives in mind. That's not a really important part for them. They want to get some money now, and then, because when you have to wait for a harvest, that's usually a big lump of some money in the future at some point. But carbon market payments might be regular payments that's more predictable. So this is some reasons why there are people who are willing to take less and are early adopters. And what we found is in the simple contract, early adopters are willing to take about $10 an acre per year. That's what these values are, willingness to accept per acre per year. And that's in fact what we found when we talk to people who have bidded with the natural capital exchange. They're bidding anywhere between $6 to $12 and being accepted within that range. Now, let me point out that we've been talking to people in the eastern U.S., not in South Dakota, so I don't know the value of carbon in your forest, because it really, it depends on, stand density and species composition and all kinds of things. So, but I'm just pointing out that it seems like when we looked at our analysis, it seems to fit what's actually going on as far as bidding. And the same thing holds true for the moderate contract and the robust contract, that the double payment seems to be matching pretty much what people are willing to accept right now. And for the moderate contract is about $42 an acre per year, and the robust contract $85 per acre per year. But I want to point out that there's a lot of variation in here, and I'm going to do that with this next slide. And that is when we looked at willingness to accept across acres owned, there was a tremendous amount of variation. So people with smaller number of acres had much higher willingness to accept payment. How much they had to be paid was much higher compared to people who had much larger acreages. And so this has to do probably with economies of scale, or with sort of trade-offs up front, the difficulty of maybe getting their forest certified, or how they plan to use their forests in the future. So when I present these averages, there's still a lot of variation from person to person. How are we doing on time here? Okay, so I think this is pretty much close to my last slide. This one's a really important one, I believe, because this is showing that climate benefits related to forest have a lot to do with forest management. The blue line that goes up, that sweeping blue line, is basically let the forest grow, don't touch it. And that's the thinking behind a lot of people as far as like helping forest be a carbon sink. Well, the rainbow waves here are basically points in the project year where thinning or harvesting occurred. And initially, there was a decrease in climate benefits across the different types of outcomes from that harvest. But overall, the benefits to climate was higher. And that's because when the wood is extracted, that carbon is stored either in the wood products or that wood is being used to substitute other kinds of materials that may be carbon intensive. So we're using wood to go into buildings versus concrete, for example. There's bioenergy, which is going to be offsetting use of fossil fuels. And then, of course, people who understand forestry, when you thin a forest and that allows more trees to grow and for more carbon to be sequestered. And usually this can reduce the risk of accidental release that comes from wildfire hazard and disease, which is more likely to damage forests that are grown at high densities. So this hasn't really made it into the carbon market, this question right now of actually managing the forest for these uses is going to provide more climate benefits in the long run. And the reason why this hasn't been, like the value of wood products in mitigating climate change have not been included in carbon markets is because there's a lot of work that needs to be done about the cradle to grave accounting of where that carbon goes. So there's already these new markets, or project developers are still getting their methodologies validated by the registries, certified. They're still in process to do this, and they're just trying to do sort of like the basic strategies while having some innovation included. They haven't been able to bring in where that wood goes once it leaves the forest and allow that to be part of the calculation as far as climate related benefits. So I just thought I'd point out that us in forestry are aware of this, but it hasn't really caught on in the carbon market context yet. And so here's my basic conclusions. Forests are only part of climate change solutions. We're already growing more wood than we cut. There's a difference between offsets versus carbon negative. And offset is just offsetting emissions, but it's allowing like things to remain the same. It's just sort of displacing additional emissions. But the rate of accumulation in the atmosphere means that we need to come up with strategies that are carbon negative, which is why there's this looking towards sinks, creating forests as sinks. But if we're growing more wood than we're cutting already, this is not really a pathway forward in the US. Maybe in Europe it is, but not necessarily in the US. So we need to think about forest management, honestly. And forest management is important to verify additionality. We know how it was managed before, and then there's a change, and now we know it's managed differently. And then there's this cradle to grave accounting of what are the ripple effects of that management change. And we also need to protect other ecosystem services. Forests are important for a lot of reasons. They can be part of climate change solutions, but they also protect our water resources. They protect biodiversity, and that we have to factor in those things as well. So this concludes my presentation. We have a growing number of articles on our Penn State Extension website. You're welcome to take a look at them. I'm very excited. Starting in January, we're going to be working on a whole new series of resources and products. So come back to Penn State Extension, next year, and you're going to see some new stuff. So this is just some of our early work that we have out right now. And so this concludes my presentation, and thank you so much for being part of this. Please take a look at my Forest Benefits and Values website. Also, if you can take that evaluation survey, that really helps me out, so I can be sure that I am communicating things people think are important and that my communication is understandable. So, and we have that link, I think, in the chat box. So I will go ahead and